Probably about 5 years ago, I saw a video of some of Nostradamus' quatrains. It wasn't the one done by Orson Welles, it was done by somebody else. And while I thought the quatrains were real interesting and fascinating even, their interpretations seemed forced, to say the least. So I went to the local library and got the books they had on Nostradamus. After reading those and researching them, I found that the quatrains themselves were pretty interesting, pretty fascinating. But again, I didn't like anybody's interpretation. And the thing to me that seemed the most lacking was that nobody tried to organize his themes. For instance, there's 8 or 10 different quatrains that mention a comet. Nobody ever connected them, and yet I think they can be connected. Nostradamus, in fact, had an original order to his 1,000 quatrains, an original order which he mixed up. He deliberately confused so that he wouldn't be persecuted by the French Inquisition. But yet there is an original order to him, and the only reason that he confused that order was because there was going to be more information revealed that way, information that he thought would get him into trouble. Imagine that one quatrain is like a puzzle piece. Okay? There's not, I mean, you can see colors on this, little blue, little gold, but you can't make the least sense out of what it actually means. And I think that that's what Nostradamus is doing with his individual quatrains, is you have some information, but trying to get a whole picture out of that, you just can't. But yet when you can take themes, for instance, I've got 8 or 10 other puzzle pieces with this theme of gold running through it. When you can take those puzzle pieces and connect them together, you get a better picture. And I think that's what you can do with Nostradamus's work. You can take his quatrains that say all mention a comet, and when you put them together, you can get a big picture of what's going on. In fact, then when you do that, you find several of those that mention an earthquake. Well, if you take then all of the earthquake themes, you find that some of the earthquake themes are related to famine. And then you can tie all those in, and just like putting a puzzle together out of individual pieces, you can take Nostradamus's quatrains and link them and put them together and make a big picture. And I think that's the unique aspect of, one of the unique aspects of my book. In Century 10, Quatrain 72, Nostradamus wrote, "The year 1999, the 7th month, from the sky will come a great king of terror, resuscitating the great king of the Mongols, before and after Mars to reign happily." In Century 3, Quatrain 34, Nostradamus wrote, "When the eclipse of the sun will then be, in broad daylight the monster will be seen. Everyone will differ on the interpretation. High price unguarded, none will have prepared." Well, we have one quatrain now that says something disastrous, terrifying is going to come from the sky in the 7th month of 1999. We now have another one that says this disastrous thing, this terrifying thing, will be seen during an eclipse. In fact, there will be a total eclipse of the sun on August 11th of 1999, perhaps the best and certainly most witnessed eclipse of this century, and it will start in England, cut all the way across the European continent, and finish in Turkey. Referring back to Century 10, Quatrain 72, how do we interpret this? Now, what does this mean? The year 1999 is simple enough, but what about the 7th month? People would assume July. But if you look at the French, the word for 7 is sept, S-E-P-T. And September was originally the 7th month. It's my opinion, and the opinion of some other commentators on Nostradamus, that he in fact is referring to the month of September, not August. Now let's go back to what I just said about the eclipse. Nostradamus is saying that during this eclipse in August, that a comet will be seen for the first time. That's not unusual. In fact, there is at least one other instance this century in which a comet was not even seen until an eclipse of the sun. In 1948 in Nairobi, Kenya, during an eclipse, a comet was seen for the first time. In fact, most comets are not even discovered until they've actually made their closest approach to the sun and are on their way back out of the solar system. But Nostradamus indicates that during this eclipse on August 11th, 1999, that a comet will be seen. And in fact, it is in the month of September, only 1 month later, that it will make a near approach to the Earth. And in fact, in other quatrains, Nostradamus indicates that the Earth will pass through the tail of that comet. In Century 2, Quatrain 47, Nostradamus wrote, "Stones raining, hidden under the fleece." Now what does that mean? In Nostradamus' time, the fleece was commonly understood as being the tail of a comet. And the only way that stones can be hidden in the fleece and rain down on the Earth is if the Earth were to actually pass through the tail of the comet. That's pretty interesting, that Nostradamus should predict even that there would be stones in the tail of a comet, because up to that time it was understood that comets were part of the unreachable sky. They were the distant, untouchable. You could not reach them, and they could not in fact come down to the Earth. And it required some foresight to even predict that the Earth could in fact pass through the tail of a comet, and that it would then rain stones upon the Earth. In Century 2, Quatrain 43, Nostradamus wrote, "During the bearded star's appearance." And a bearded star in his time was commonly understood as the coma of the comet. In line 3 of that same quatrain, he wrote, "Hit from the sky, earth trembling." He indicates that something relating to that comet would actually hit the Earth. Since he also predicted that the Earth would pass through the tail of the comet, he's predicting a somewhat substantial rock that would hit the Earth. Now, how big is that rock? In Century 1, Quatrain 69, Nostradamus gives us a clue as to the size of that rock that will hit the Earth. In the first line of the quatrain is written, "The great mountain round of 7 stadia." A stadia at that time was the size of a stadium. And if you take the length of 7 stadia as the circumference of the rock, you have a diameter of about 1/4 mile. Now, making rough estimates of the speed with which that rock will be moving, and using the formula that the kinetic energy equals 1/2 mv squared, you can get a rough idea as to the energy involved should a rock that size hit the Earth. In fact, what you end up with is the explosive force of roughly 133,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs going off in a 2-block area instantaneously. Now, where will that impact take place? Nostradamus indicates that it will happen in an ocean, not over land. That's not terribly surprising, because 70% of the Earth's surface is water anyway. It's likely that that type of explosion would occur over the water. In fact, what would the result of that be? What does an explosion of 133,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs give you? If you could take all of the energy and convert it into, say, an earthquake, you would end up with an earthquake in excess of a 15.0 on the Richter scale. And that would not even take place on the surface of the water. Given the speed at which the meteor would be moving, it would take place on the ocean floor. So you have a tremendous earthquake spreading out at the bottom of the ocean crust. And even as it gets hundreds and hundreds of miles away to the land surface, it's still going to have enough push, enough punch, to actually shake the buildings several feet vertically up and down. At the site of the impact, the Earth is going to bounce, just like a child jumping on a bed, only the bounce is going to be perhaps 1,000, 2,000, maybe even 10,000 feet. Now, hundreds of miles away, it's still going to be a couple of feet. And what you're going to end up with is buildings collapsing, pipelines breaking, small fires everywhere. Let's go back to Century 1, Quatrain 69 again. In the third line of that quatrain, Nostradamus wrote, "It will roll far away, sinking great countries." Well, what will roll far away? A tsunami. He's talking about a substantial tidal wave. There have been several calculations made as to the size of a tidal wave that would result from a quarter-mile in diameter meteor or larger impacting onto the ocean. And in fact, you could anticipate tsunami waves of anywhere from 50 to perhaps 200 feet or more on every shore surrounding the ocean. Now, if in fact the earthquake has already started small fires and caused some destruction, what the tsunami is going to serve to do is take those fires, especially if it's petrochemical in nature, and spread them out on the surface of the water and spread them all over the entire coastline. And in fact, what would result would be huge and massive firestorms. Nostradamus seems to indicate that this impact will take place in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. Should that actually happen, you could cripple the entire eastern seaboard of the United States and all of Western Europe. The dust, the rocks, the sea salt sucked into the atmosphere would create a nuclear winter. Planet would get far colder. Food production would suffer. Famine would be a widespread event. The change in technology after all this would be unprecedented. Communications would revert back to the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. Communication satellites would be gone. Transoceanic cable would be snapped. The importing and exporting of countries all over the world would be greatly hampered. What does all this have? What impacts on society? Basically, the political state of the world would be a decimated Europe that was still relatively food rich. Western Europe actually exports roughly 20 million metric tons of grain a year. They would have their food, but not their technology. On the other hand, Asia imports 90 to 100 million metric tons of food a year. They would have their technology, but not their food. And in fact, then we would be setting up for a World War III between an industrial intact but food poor Asia and a relatively food rich but industrially destroyed Europe. And that is in fact Nostradamus' vision of World War III. Now, how does Nostradamus' vision of the future correspond with other sources? There are, in fact, links, almost identical passages, with Nostradamus' quatrains and prophecies from the Bible, especially Revelation. For instance, let me read something from Revelation. "And I saw the Lamb break open the sixth seal. There was a violent earthquake, and the sun became black like coarse black cloth, and the moon turned completely red like blood. The stars fell down to the earth like unripe figs falling from the tree when a strong wind shakes it. The sky disappeared like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place." What does that mean? Every commentary that I am aware of on Revelation either interprets this passage symbolically, or they don't even make an attempt to explain it. They just go right past it. But yet, I believe it explains a very physical, very understandable event. And in fact, if a meteor should impact into the ocean, the explosion and the dust cloud that it would generate explains this entire passage. A violent earthquake. Well, if you're talking something in excess of a 15 on the Richter scale, you have a very violent earthquake. And the sun became black like coarse black cloth, and the moon turned red like blood. How can you do that? It can't be a change in the intrinsic brightness of the sun and the moon, because the sun always has to be brighter than the moon. You know, the moon just reflects light, but yet the sun is black and the moon is only red. It must be how they appear to us. And if in fact you're standing on the east coast of the United States, and this huge dust cloud is spreading out of the Atlantic Ocean, a rising sun wouldn't even rise, it would be black. And yet a setting moon would be red as the dust started to obscure it. The stars fell down to the earth like unripe figs falling from the tree. If the earth is passing through the tail of a comet and it is dense with dust and small stones, that's exactly what it would appear to be. little stars actually coming through the atmosphere, and some of them perhaps big enough to even land on the Earth like hail. And the sky disappeared like a scroll being rolled up. Imagine on a bright blue sunny day that the dust cloud started rolling across the heaven. Now St. John in the 1st century, the best way he could understand this was that somebody was rolling up the sky rather than the dust cloud spreading over. And that's just one example of how things that Nostradamus had to say correlate with things that the Bible had to say. There are in fact many others, and I believe that all of the 6th through 9th chapters of Revelation correspond with his vision of the earth passing through the tail of a comet and the disaster that would bring. There are also many correlations into the Old Testament, Book of Amos, Book of Joel, some of the prophets, that basically talk about the same thing, about the sun growing very dark and the moon turning as red as blood. Imagine if Nostradamus is right, and if my interpretation of him is right. What if during this eclipse in August of '99 a comet should appear? And if in September the Earth should pass through the tail of it and we should have a large meteoric impact? What's going to happen in the world? Well, one of the major places and major religions to consider is Islam. Many Islams, particularly the Shiite sect, are waiting for a man that they call the Mahdi, a man who will unite all of Islam together. And there are over 1 billion Muslims in the world. But the Mahdi will unite all of Islam together into a single religious and civilian government. It is then their expectation that he will conquer the entire world and unite the entire world under Allah. And after that, then the world will end. Now, should this actually happen, it's not hard to imagine all of Islam uniting into a single country. There's going to be people all over the world believing that the world is about to end, and they won't be any different. And that is in fact how Nostradamus sets up World War III. It's a united Muslim nation waging war against a Christian Western Europe. And throughout his writings, it's the invading armies from North Africa and Asia against all of Europe. And he makes great statements about the religious nature of the war. Christianity against Islam, Islam against Christianity, kind of like the Crusades, only in reverse and taking place on European soil. In the Quran, Muhammad predicted that his followers would conquer Spain and later reconquer it. Now, they conquered it many centuries ago and were driven out in 1492. They believe that they will occupy and own Spain once again. In his quatrains, Nostradamus speaks about a Muslim invasion conquering not only Spain, but then continuing on into France from there. Nostradamus has a great many predictions about a man called the Blue Turban. The man that Nostradamus describes as the Blue Turban and the characteristics that he attributes to him bear striking similarities to what Islam expects out of a man that they will call the Mahdi. They are in fact, to all appearances, the same person. They have the same place of origin, apparently the same personality, and they're both described as being conquerors and invaders of Europe. If in fact you then compare what the Bible has to say about a man that they call the Antichrist also corresponds with not only the Blue Turban but the Mahdi as well. And those three persons may in fact all be the same individual. And it may be that the Antichrist of Christianity is in fact coming from Islam. How often was Nostradamus right? There are in fact 8 quatrains in which he mentions specific years. The one for 1999 is the last one. Of the first 7, how well did he do? Depending on how much room you want to give him for artistic leeway, his accuracy rate is somewhere between about 20 and 40%. So the chances are this isn't going to happen. Okay? But if it does, We're talking about the deaths of billions and billions of people around the world, not only from the impact, but then from the starvation and the industrial collapse and the World War III that would follow. If Nostradamus is only 20% right, if he's only 2% right, what if he is? What if this actually happens? People need to at least consider the possibility that it can, and consider where we may all end up. It's a very depressing story. What's the good news? The good news is we're all going to die anyway. Whether Nostradamus was right or wrong, you have at most a few decades left in your life. Think about how you're going to spend it. Everybody gets the same amount of time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can spend it however you want, but you can only spend it once. What Nostradamus is telling us, what the Bible is telling us, is that the world is not permanent, and what you do and what life is all about is not in materialism. It's in your religious values. It's in who you are as a person. It's in your relationships. And if nothing else, I hope people get out of my book the perspective that things can change at any moment, and that all that really counts is what you take with you into the next life. Nostradamus was born in the early 1500s in France and died in 1566. In his early years he was a medical doctor and gained something of a reputation as being skilled at treating the Black Plague, although his cures were somewhat unusual for the time. He didn't let blood. He actually advised people to get rid of the rats in town. Which nobody else was concerned with, but in fact that ended up making a big difference. He made lozenges and potions that were basically health food and tried to get people to heal themselves. His prophetic career did not start until he was well into his 40s and basically occupied the last 20 years of his life. Do I think this is all going to happen? I hope not. It might. What if it does? Or even what if it doesn't? What if I have predicted it or my analysis is faulty? The Earth still stands at a crossroads. Every single year we're adding 100 million people to the planet, and yet it appears that our ability to produce food is about to max out. What happens then? It's been said that the number of people we have searching for comets, meteors, asteroids, it would be the work crew of a normal McDonald's, and they're paid about as well too. Well, eventually another rock from space is going to fall on the Earth, and if we're not looking for them and preparing for them, then we're fools. You know, I would hope out of this that an effort would be made to try and identify the asteroids, the meteors that threaten Earth, that we can find them before it's too late to do something about them. When the meteor impacts and there's this tremendous explosion, there are going to be billions of rock fragments the size of a fist or so that are going to be ejected into Earth orbit at speeds of 6 and 7 miles a second. Within a few years at most, every satellite in space will be destroyed. Communications, military intelligence, weather satellites, they're all going to be gone, and Earth orbit may be hazardous enough that it may be a few hundred years before we can put any up again. Another thing that's going to happen should a meteor impact into an ocean somewhere is that the water is going to heat up. We're talking temperatures from the explosion itself in excess of 100 million degrees in the center of the fireball. If you take an area of ocean that's, say, 36 square miles and heat it to 120 degrees, which is going to be fairly easily done by an explosion this size, you don't generate standard size hurricanes anymore. Should a meteor hit in the ocean and heat the water temperature to just 120 degrees over an area of 36 square miles, standard hurricanes don't form anymore. The wind speed off hurricanes that generate off water that temperature are in excess of 500 miles an hour. The eye of the hurricane is only 100 yards in diameter, and the hurricane itself will reach 20 to 30 miles into the sky and will suck water vapor and sea salts right up into the stratosphere, where they will spread out and basically darken the sun and further contribute to a nuclear winter. Every day or two, as these hurricanes move off that hot water, another one will form. Now, as soon as it moves off the hot water, the winds begin to slow down greatly, and they'll either die out or perhaps turn into hurricanes with winds of 140 or 150 miles an hour. But these are going to be forming every few days. With an impact into the Atlantic Ocean, the vast majority of those are headed into the Caribbean and into the Gulf and East Coast of the United States. How many of those are going to form? Who can say? It may even be dozens. Which countries are going to be fighting in World War III? What are the sides going to be? On the one side is going to be any country from North Africa or Asia that is primarily Muslim in population. Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, perhaps even China or part of China, and the Muslim republics of the former Soviet Union. Who are these people going to be fighting against? The countries of Europe. England, France, Spain, Italy, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, Hungary, Greece, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia. That is basically going to be the fighting sides. Where is the United States going to be in World War III? We're going to be consumed by domestic problems, especially with the loss of our Atlantic port facilities and the loss of our satellites, and with the severe nuclear winter that will follow. The United States will be consumed by domestic problems, and it will perhaps be a few decades before our foreign affairs are any more important than Canada and Mexico. What happens in the rest of the world? Nostradamus doesn't say. The book of Revelation indicates that World War III will touch 25% of the planet, 25% of the land mass. During World War II, war actually touched only 10% of the planet. So World War III, the areas that see combat will be 2 to even 3 times greater than World War II. But Nostradamus had nothing to say about it. It seems reasonable that war will also include, say, China and Vietnam, China and India, perhaps even China making raids into Australia. Nostradamus did not see that as his responsibility to predict. Nostradamus did not have anything to say about what might happen in South America. His primary concern was what was going to happen in Europe. I think having a world economy that is entirely interconnected, that relies on imports and exports, is stupid. If the United States was energy independent, which we were when Ronald Reagan took office, wars in the Middle East would be completely unimportant to us. But as it is now, our national security depends on flow of oil out of the Mideast. That's not right. That's not the way it should be. 100 years ago, America was essentially independent. In 100 years ago, America was essentially independent in its basics. We provided our own food, our own clothing, our own shelter. Now, what happens in any number of countries around the world has the potential to cripple our economy. The United States was built on self-sufficiency and self-reliancy, and that's still the best way to do things. Several of those that mention an earthquake. Well, if you take then all of the earthquake themes, you find that some of the earthquake themes are related to famine. And then you can tie all those in, and just like putting a puzzle together out of individual pieces, you can take Nostradamus' quatrains and link them and put them together and make a big picture. And I think that's the unique aspect of, one of the unique aspects of my book. In probably about 5 years ago, I saw a video of some of Nostradamus' quatrains. It wasn't the one done by Orson Welles, it was done by somebody else. And while I thought the quatrains were real interesting and fascinating even, their interpretations seemed forced, to say the least. So I went to the local library and got the books they had on Nostradamus. After reading those and researching them, I found that the quatrains themselves were pretty interesting, pretty fascinating. But again, I didn't like anybody's interpretation. And the thing to me that seemed the most lacking was that nobody tried to organize his themes. For instance, there's 8 or 10 different quatrains that mention a comet. Nobody ever connected them, and yet I think they can be connected. Nostradamus, in fact, had an original order to his 1,000 quatrains, an original order which he mixed up. He deliberately confused so that he wouldn't be persecuted by the French Inquisition. But yet there is an original order to him, and the only reason that he confused that order was because there was going to be more information revealed that way, information that he thought would get him into trouble. Imagine that one quatrain is like a puzzle piece. Okay? There's not, I mean, you can see colors on this, little blue, little gold, but you can't make the least sense out of what it actually means. And I think that that's what Nostradamus is doing with his individual quatrains, is you have some information, but trying to get a whole picture out of that, you just can't. But yet when you can take themes, for instance, I've got 8 or 10 other puzzle pieces with this theme of gold running through it. When you can take those puzzle pieces and connect them together, you get a better picture. And I think that's what you can do with Nostradamus' work. You can take his quatrains that say all mention a comet, and when you put them together, you can get a big picture of what's going on. In fact, then when you do that, you find